All right. Good morning, everyone. Also, classmates, and of course, Sir Chippy. And thank you for the opportunity to present with this one. My topic to be presented is I have created a subject out of that context, which I called it Tools for Enterprise Architecture Management Principles, Guidelines, and Agile Practices on a Large Scale Agile Development. Then it is derived from the book titled Architecting the Digital Transformation, which is on the chapter 17. There's a topic there, or there's an article, sub-article there, discussing that there's a tool supporting architecture principles and guidelines in large-scale agile development. So it was written by, I'm not sure if I can say their name properly, but it's Omer Uludağ, Sasha Nägele, Matthes Hauder, and Mr. Florian Matthes. So just an outline or to provide what this presentation is all about. Yeah. So that we could be guided by this presentation. Well, this presentation has been designed to provide the understanding of enterprise architecture principles. So I start with there, and also the guidelines in a large scale agile development. Then followed by, of course, discuss the synopsis of enterprise architecture management and what are the different principles and agile methodologies, and of course the agile principles, so that we could freshen up a little bit because we are working leaning towards with a tool in engaging with these two kind of principles. Then I have prepared some examples from a real world scenario of enterprise architecture principles, guidelines in a large scale agile development. So based on the actual experience. And lastly is the to discuss a tool that can be a solution or can be, a way of doing filling the gaps and working on the challenges of the enterprise architecture practices in a large or complex scale agile development. Then, aside from the description of the presentation, so I have formulated some learning objectives, or what can we gain by by participating with this presentation, or basically by listening. Sorry. Yeah. Of course. First, to understand the complexity of enterprise architecture principles and guidelines in relation to agile practices on a large scale development, because it's really complex when I got to to review it, to research it, and check on it. It's really complex. It's really vague. So I'll try my best to to discuss some actual experience and examples so that we can relate. Then another learning objective is, of course, we need to know what are the gaps and what are the challenges. Eventually, we will be implementing enterprise architecture principles and marry it to the agile practices. Then there are probably gaps and challenges that we might encounter during the course of our practice, and we need to identify those. And another part of learning objective is the design classifications. So this is actually based on what we have learned so far from the different topics that Sir GP have discussed. No, I used to watch all of the YouTube videos, of course, to gain additional knowledge, and it actually helped me in preparing this presentation and consider the design classification that can be useful in formulating and using tools to address these gaps and challenges. And there is a particular tool and solution that the authors of the article focuses with, which is actually they call it the architecture belt. And it's not Googleable, by the way. And yeah, and it's really fun and it's really good that to know what is architecture belt. Yeah, I'll discuss that in the course of the presentation. Then, as promised, I'll start with the synopsis. Synopsis for enterprise architecture. Yeah, there you go. In a nutshell, it's a conceptual blueprint, all right, that defines the structure and operation of the entire organization. So it's a blueprint. Then, hence, in of course, in information technology, if we use the enterprise architecture in IT or in management information systems, it is actually the representation and behavior an enterprise IT landscape in relation to the business environment. So you have the business drivers, you have the data, you have the application, front-end, back-end application that supports the data and the business objectives. Then finally, you have the technology that you will be using so that, you can make out of the benefit from the enterprise architecture that you are working with. Then there are a lot of architecture principles actually, and some of it that I would like to share with you is one of the important is business principle, of course, from the architecture principle. Well, business principle, just to give you a refresher on this, it provides a basis for decision making throughout the business, right? So that's the idea when you are dealing with the business principle for architectural principles. And the example of this principle under business principle is that the category are compliance with statutory obligations, to where the function should adhere to the legal requirements of different governing agency. Like for instance, here in the country, in the Philippines, any systems needs to comply with the BIR tax ruling, the proper computations of landed costs, right, or importation costs, etc. And another one is principle is the business continuity. Then with this principle, it enables the organization to promote, of course, the continuity of all of the processes. And well, I just remember that business continuity, you are working with business continuity during the course of the disruption, not after the disruption. So that's business continuity when it comes to principle of the architecture. Then it covers also the backup, the recovery time objectives, and of course, other things that matters to business continuity per se. Then another enterprise architecture principle that I would like to share which is really important for IT, is the data principles. With data principles, these are the data security, data or information as an asset, um, what else? Data analogy, and of course, other processes to data like sharing, accessibility, are being taken care of when you are practicing the enterprise architecture principle. Then let me add another one. So another one is application principles, because later on we will be dealing with data application and marry it to the agile practices. Then when we say application principles, this is to provide guidance on the use and deployment of all IT applications. So that would be your guidelines. And in fact, the application principle is part of the hierarchy or the structure framework of EA or the enterprise architecture. Then apart from it, there are also called enterprise architecture guidelines, which help to administer the project for consistency of practice and promote standardization of processes. So this is different from principle. When you say guideline, it promotes standardization of processes. It promotes best practice. It promotes culture of excellence, and other things. That when you are working with different IT, like in programming, in service deployment, you have consistency in everything you do because you have that guideline or the consistency in practice. And we called it enterprise architecture guidelines. Then it can be customizable. For example, you can have the EA, the enterprise architecture guideline for admin processes, like for the forms, for the layouts, etc. Then for the backing services, on how to properly code when you are part of the programming team, no? The code-based processes or the code-based guidelines, etc. There are a lot actually, and I can't really discuss a lot of those things because it will take so much of our time. And in fact, this is just a synopsis for enterprise architecture. Then another synopsis that I would like to share is the synopsis for Agile methodology. So I'm pretty much sure that we are all familiar here because Sir Chippy was able to discuss this during the previous subjects that we had. Then just to highlight again and to freshen our mind about it, Agile methodology. This is actually one of my notes. I took this from what I've learned from the subject of our subject, which is advanced systems design. It is the way to manage a project by breaking it up into several phases. So it's pretty much straightforward. So, and another notes for me is that when you're dealing with agile method, or principle, it has a constant collaboration with stakeholders and continuous improvement at every stage. You don't have to wait to the end phase or the after the parallel testing or UAT before you do the accreditation. You can collaborate with the stakeholders and you can do continuous improvement at every single stage that's been agreed. We call it sprint, right? If we could remember that. Then it has different methods like Kanban and Scrum, XP, Crystal, DSDM. So yeah, and just a quick note on that. Kanban, most likely, well, from my perspective and from what I've learned, is Kanban. When you say Kanban, you focus more on the process dashboards, meaning you deal more on the processes. You focus on the learnings of the processes of the project or the methods that you are using. Then when you are practicing the Scrum, um, it is actually the method focuses more on the backlogs. Then when you are doing on the backlogs, of course, you might prepare to practice Scrum because that is the principle when it comes to Agile. Then XP is extreme programming. Focuses in improving the software quality and responsiveness to changing customer requirements. Another definition is that XPs also support frequent releases, no, in short development cycles to improve quality and allow developers, of course, to respond to changing customer requirements because it's agile anyway. Then another method is the Crystal. Well, Crystal Agile focuses more on individuality and the interactions of this individual. Meaning to say, when you are practicing Crystal, you have multiple teams depending on the size, depending on the practice of your Crystal. Teams can find ways on their own to improve and optimize their workflows. We can do that in Crystal. And every project is unique and always changing, which is why the project teams is best suited to determine how it will tackle the work because it focuses on their individuality or the uniqueness of their teams. And actually, that is the two core beliefs from Crystal, if I am not mistaken. Then DSDM. Well, DSDM is dynamic system development method. It's part also of Agile principle and methods. It has the philosophy of any project must be aligned to clearly defined strategic goals and focus upon early delivery of real benefits to the business since it focuses on the full project life cycle. So it's quite big because when you are practicing the SDM with Agile, you need to be more careful in considering the changes in working on the delivery goals so that you can take the real benefits to the business objectives. There you go. So yeah, there are five um, methods, different methods for Agile methodology. And yeah, since we have freshened our memories about EA or the enterprise architecture and Agile, let's go back now to the core topic to understand the complexity of enterprise architecture principles and guidelines in relation to Agile practices on a large scale Agile development, meaning we go big. But first, let's discuss what's the situation to serve as our basis in determining the gaps, challenges, and of course the tools or solutions that we can make use of it or we can make use of. Well, from the article, yeah, I have noticed different situations highlighted by the authors. The first situation is that they said that organizations are challenged to the technological advancements and trends, which is really true. Because during the pre-pandemic, right, we all know that Grab is only designed for taxi, right? But right now they deliver food, they have also this pabili, etc. And they are challenged as well with technological advancement and trends. And another highlight of the situation mentioned from the article is that um, exposure to turbulent market conditions due to factors such as increasing customer demands, globalization, and intense time to market pressures. So just to highlight that, time to market, meaning just this is just a review. Um, it is the time required to move a product or service from conception to market or until it is available to be purchased. So ito yung paunahan, right? Kung sino yung maging pilot with the product. And we all know that it is really important to be the first in the market and take the benefits of being a leader in the business competitions, right? And that is the reason why those who are first in the business category, like the first one to develop the iOS, like they are now the first also the first trillion company, right? 3 trillion company, I think, um, in the history, right? And yeah, due to the past phase environment, and another one is ability to detect relevant changes and to react timely and effectively becomes an important determinant for business survival. So those are the three situations highlighted from the article, which I also consider. And due to the past-phase environment, yeah, as mentioned, the ability to detect relevant changes and to react timely and effectively becomes an important determinant for business survival. Hence, the use of practice now of agile becomes now popular because we all know that agile is agility, right? And based on the methods and definitions a while ago, it can be used when in a fast-paced environment. And of course, the problem right now is on how to marry it with the enterprise architecture and to marry it again to a large-scale development using agile. Um, then the adoption of agile methods at scale poses new challenges, of course, such as establishing effective knowledge networks or coordinating various development activities to produce desirable enterprise-wide effects, and by means also of applying the enterprise architecture principles. Then, however, there is a lack of research based on the authors. They mentioned that there is a lack of research on how architecture principles can be created and applied it in a larger scale agile development. Then with this, we will be discussing on the next slides on how to address this, of course, and as well as identifying the gaps, challenges, so we can address the same. But prior to that, yeah, I have prepared actually an interview with the actual project manager, certified project manager in the organization. Her name is actually Elaine, and she is one of the certified PMP and ITIL certified and practitioner. And she is actually the current project manager in a group of companies with nearly 4,000 full-time employees and has 21 affiliated companies. So just this is just to realize that it's really happening in the real world scenario. Okay, so yeah, good afternoon, Elaine. So hi, thank you for giving me this opportunity to conduct a brief interview with you on the different practices in enterprise architecture in a real world scenario. Well, first, can you please introduce yourself and for the benefits of our listeners?
Sure, Chris. Hi, I'm Elaine Lacson, currently the PMO or Project Manager for Jaka Group. Well, I do manage different teams for different landscapes in enterprise architecture, which focuses in systems and software development and improvements for Jaka Group.
Wow, that's nice. That's nice. Yeah, can you be more specific on what kind of organization does Jaka is?
So Jaka Group consists of 21 companies and has different business types like manufacturing, retail, food, warehouse and logistics, finance, and investments. So we are part of a management information system which provides shared service function to these companies, or we called it affiliates.
Nice. Thank you, Elaine. Well, I'll go straight to the point by asking these few questions on my list since you are pretty much busy. Being a project manager, have you handled complex projects with multiple teams? And what usually are their compositions and discipline when it comes to enterprise architecture?
Yeah, yes, I have. We have actually a lot on our plate since we used different systems for different business types. One that I can see is the ERP system that is being developed and some are being improved based on the functional requirements and business requirement specification as agreed and improved with the stakeholders. There are different composition of these different teams. One has the role of enterprise solution architect. There are also enterprise architect consultants. On the development side, there are different teams handling programming, analysis, coding, documentation, there's testers, QAs, front end and back end teams, and even database teams. So the said system is actually developed for lean process of manufacturing, retail, logistic, warehousing, and integration of different APIs to some existing systems in the organization. Well, I can say that based on my project management, there are different practices, principles, and methodologies per team that is actually a big challenge for us, since we should practice the principle of Agile to our enterprise architecture in general as agreed.
Wow. Well, thank you. That's quite informative, no? And yeah, thank you for that clear answer and actual statements, or should I say, actual experience of yours in handling complex projects in enterprise resource planning systems. Well, granting that this is your situation, you mentioned that each team seems practice different principles and methods in spite of that they were being told, I guess, that everyone should work on with principles of agile and marry it to the enterprise architecture principles, which was approved by the stakeholders, right? How do you handle this as project manager? And would you know the answer too on how the respective team leaders or team leads of each or team members handle their situations, including the enterprise architects and consultants?
Well, to be honest, Chris, sobrang hirap. So imagine that we have different teams
Yeah.
handling different objectives like codings, programming, etc. And these people actually came from different practices and exposure. And
Uh-huh.
the first major concerns that I notice is that there is a tendency really na they will keep coming back to their own practices
Mm.
since yun yung comfort zone nila eh. Perhaps that's the reason why.
Yeah.
So, ayun. Another challenge is on how to handle and making sure that everyone progress on the right track
Mm-hmm.
and conduct of different disciplines of agile and principle of enterprise architecture from coding up to QA processes prior to deployment and user acceptance. So it's really challenging
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes it's really a showstopper to us
Wow.
in pushing the objectives of the goal of the project.
Wow. That's yeah. Well, I can relate to that. Sometimes I do I do well not just monitor but experiences the same situation that of yours, no? Well, at least you are aware of that, no? And that's actually an excellent observation and analysis of your of the dynamics of your project management. Well, okay. Yeah. So as of the moment, I'll stop here before I got involved with your situation. Just kidding. Thank you, Elaine, for your time and for sharing your experience as the project manager for a complex, enterprise architecture with agile software development.
You're welcome and thanks to
Yeah. Stay safe. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thanks for your
you
time,
too.
Elaine. Yeah. Regards.
Bye.
Bye bye. Yeah. So just to summarize, so this is actually a 6 minute interview with the project manager from Jaka Group. And the idea is that they are practicing actually the enterprise architecture principles and guidelines since they are longing to develop the ERP systems of these different affiliates, which is in line with manufacturing, logistics, warehousing, investments, and different types of business units. Then the challenge is that they have this different multiple teams and different IT groups and different software developers, and they also have this enterprise architect and enterprise consultant. Then the question right now is, of course, the technicality they can do that, but the pressing challenges actually is that how to make sure that these enterprise architecture disciplines are being met and being complied, which is approved by the stakeholders across the board. And that's actually the idea of this interview. And just to show that it's really happening in a real world scenario, the enterprise architecture principles and marrying it to agile um, systems development or software development in the case of Elaine. Then on the next slide, so I even summarize it more and compare it with the challenges defined by the authors, which is actually I'm quite surprised because uh, when I when I check on this, it says that from the authors, there is a tendency to ignore the architecture principles by the agile teams. Then, as experienced by Elaine and defined by Elaine during the interview process, um, one of the challenge that she mentioned is that ignoring the approved architecture principles and the tendency to go back to their own practice, meaning the agile teams to go back to their own practice because they're using different practice and these are different people practicing different methods on their minds, which is adopted by different organizations. Then Elaine mentioned that they tendency to go back because of the comfort zone scenario. Then another thing highlighted by the author with the challenges is that no structured feedback mechanisms between agile teams and enterprise architects when you are working the enterprise architecture principles and marry it with the agile principles in a large scale agile development. So with this number two, yeah, because there are no structured feedback mechanism, architects or enterprise architects have no insight into the extent to which the defined principles are helpful to the work of agile teams. So, or pwedeng pampabigat lang, di ba? So that's the idea. And which is na-experience in Elaine. From with Elaine's interview, she mentioned that there's no clear feedback mechanism as well between architects, consultant, and agile teams. She mentioned also that there are no feedback at all. The agile teams are just, doing their job and okay, pag nagka-problema, ayusin na lang, something like that. And it all boils down to her responsibility as the project manager, which, uh, becomes tedious process. And instead of achieving the goals, there are a lot of, you know, um, pendings, backlogs to work on because of this because of the absence of clear feedback mechanisms. Then number three is lack of tools and control to check, monitor the compliance to the specified architecture principles. The author highlighted that enterprise architects are missing the suitable tools to check whether agile teams comply with specified architecture principles or not. Then Elaine mentioned that it's very tedious to monitor, difficult in handling the compliance, whether the teams are aligned to the right track of approved principles and guidelines or complying at all. Then last but not the least is as mentioned by the authors, there is no central place for document management for EA principles. That's the reason why it can be neglected. And if there is another project, they will need to go back to scratch and put everything in place again. Then for Elaine, there's documentation because there's a PMO, there's a project management office, but the documentation is very limited and only handled by the project managers or the project manager. And with that case, there are a lot of tendency that the agile teams working on the certain program or application forgot to work the and forgot to document the changes, forgot to document the functional specification, etc., and so on during the course of the project because they are practicing agile. You mentioned, remember that agile is more on continuous improvement while you are on the process, not you while ending up the process. So pretty much that's the content of that interview. So it's just fantastic that it's a really realization also for me that it's really happening. Then it's really good to know how to work on these challenges and how to handle this situation if we are about to experience this in actual. Then yeah, aside from the challenges, so there are noticeable gaps mentioned by the authors from the article. When we say gaps, it's the current state going to the desired state. When what can be the action plan, the key steps to bridge the gap. So those are the action items for working on the gaps. No? And the first gap that highlighted from the article is that how architecture principles are established in general. Then the second one is how they should be enforced without encountering the resistance of agile teams. Then the third one is how this process can be supported. So those are the three major gaps identified by the authors, which is really evident when you are working in actual, based on the actual experience mentioned also by Elaine. Then, well, of course, there's a solution always. And we called it tools, and the authors called it tools. And there are two defined tools or solutions that we can discuss about this topic. Then the first defined tool or solution is the collaborative approach for establishing architecture principles and guidelines, which is more of process-oriented. So collaborative approach is more of process-oriented. Then it was based on the insights from actually from a single case study of a global insurance company, which is highlighted by the authors. And it's a model. The collaborative approach becomes a model when you are handling the enterprise architecture principles and marry it to the agile principles, then put it together uh, and practice it together in a complex environment. Then the said approach, the CA, adapts the generic architecture principle process by and complements the top-down enforcement. So meaning from top, the instructions coming from the top going down. So top-down enforcement of the architecture principles and guidelines, then with some influence driven by a centric view, which is later on I'll be discussed that in summarize. Then, however, this approach can be considered as a solution. It contradicts with the agile and lean values because, as we mentioned, collaborative approach is more of command and control, while um, while to effectively govern agile teams working on your project, a lean approach should be observed, right? That's the reason why it's called agile. Should be observed that is based on collaboration and motivations among teams and stakeholders. Then the second tool or solution is called the architecture belt, which will be discussed later. Then for now, let's have a quick overview for the collaborative approach as described by the authors. So since this is a process-based solution or tool, so it consists of different steps that we need to follow. So it starts, of course, with the step one. Step one meaning determine the determination of drivers. When we say determination of drivers, this is the enterprise architect's goals, objectives, values, legal requirements or compliance, and what are the potential risks and rewards. Then for agile teams, with this one on the other side of the hemisphere, the implementation experiences, issues, team specific agreements, and technical innovation. Those are part of the inputs. Then on the next step, which is step two, and they called it determine principles and guidelines. Now, both groups will create a list of possible principles that they will use, that they will adopt, then select which is relevant, of course, to the entirety of the project, and formulate that principle as a statements. Then the outputs will be then suggested as candidates for the COP. COP meaning community of practice, which is the step three on the center, this one, that specifies and classify the principles. So you have that principle, you just need to classify it together, and you need to, provide the specifications. Then the proposed principles are specified into one or more guidelines that can be specific to the said principle. It can be like that. It will then set on, it can set one or more metrics to ease the fulfillment, and of course, since it's a metric, it can measure the performance, which is called the KPIs, the key performance indicators. Then on the step four, there you go, vote and accept. Um, when we say vote and accept in the step four, it is by using a democratic consensus decision, meaning the COP, the community of practice, practitioners votes on the adoption, refinement, or rejection of a principle or guideline with the exceptions of principles that are related to or driven by legal requirements from the step one. So meaning to say, ang hindi lang kasama dapat na we need to spare the legality, yung mga legal requirements, but the rest can be voted out. depending on the agreement between the architects and the agile teams who will perform the job. Then step 5 will now focus on applying the principles since it is voted anyway, and it can be done. Then as shown from the illustration, the agile teams apply the architecture principles and guidelines that are accepted by the community of practice. And of course, the enterprise architects assist them during the realization because enterprise architects are the one who provide enterprise architecture principles, and the agile teams provides the guidelines on how to perform the deliverables, what are the best practices that can be aligned with the community of practice when we marry the enterprise architects and the agile teams. Then second to the last is step 6. It says that managing the compliance. This is actually dedicated to managing the compliance for both groups, not just for agile team or not just for EA, for both groups. Then the last step would be the step 7, which is handling the changes in adherence also to the agile methodology. And as mentioned, the solution is a process oriented, right? And based on the top down enforcement with command and control, which can still lead to the challenges and gaps mentioned previously. Because in Agile, uh, you might encounter different changes, different modification as you go along. And if you notice, in collaborative approach, the handling of these changes are on the step 7. So, and that is the reason. And the challenges on tendency to ignore the architecture principles, the gaps on enforcing without encountering resistance, the things that we mentioned a while ago in the gaps, and also the compliance with specified principles and even to the legal requirements, etc. The things that we listed from the gaps. Then it is best also to have a more simple solution, right, to a complex one, and make it more simpler and more effective with lesser things to do and to process, right? So I think that is an agreement, right? So that it can be we can focus more on the objectives rather than the steps on achieving the objectives. Because in collaborative approach, it's really okay. You can practice this. We can practice this as mentioned. This is a case study from the global insurance company, as mentioned by the authors, and it is really actually working. But when you are dealing more on the complex environment, then in agile, so we really need to develop something from it. Then, as mentioned, when I personally, when I tend to look for solutions, especially in administering and managing problems, I always go back to this principle. Actually, this is one of my principles that I've learned in the past. Make it simple, make it even more simpler if possible. Then, but yes, yet precise. And when I say that, in this way, rapid deployments of a certain project or solutions can be possible, and getting also the benefits out from it will be more easier to achieve. Then automating things in a simple way will, eradicate human factor errors because you have the standard guidelines, while the ends are being met exponentially. Then another benefit that comes in my mind when I used to think of it, it can promote the culture of excellence since it can be easy to follow, since it's simple, it can be easily to be adopted, identify improvements and use the time more efficient and more effectively rather than focus more on the steps. Then this comes into my mind when the author introduced the prototype of the architecture belt solution, which is the next topic. So since it's architecture belt, so we are reminded that it uses the belt categories like in Taekwondo. They have this white belter, yellow belter, green belter, blue belter, and black belter. Similar with Six Sigma, right? If you remember that. But let's focus more on the architecture belt. Then I go straight forward to it. As defined from the article and described, of course, by the authors, it consists of the Angular single page application serving as the front end, which is communicating with the Spring Boot backend and its exposed REST API by HTTP calls. And the Spring Boot backend access a MySQL database with the use of JPA2 and Hibernate ORM.3. JPA is the Java Persistence API, which I mentioned naman Sir GPN before, especially the REST API. So that is actually the system architecture of architecture belt. They made it more simple. There you go. And it uses MySQL database. Then another definition of architecture belt to get more familiarized with it is that if we compare these two frameworks, framework based on different models, belt models, and this is the other one, the and this is the architecture belt framework. So if you notice, it simplified everything. Then steps are gone, and most likely the idea now is to consider the belt as the gauge for culture of excellence. So later on, I'll be explaining that. And of course, without sacrificing the objectives, like the objectives of having the goals, having the determination of principles, having the specification and classification of principles and guidelines from different groups, etc. So it's still incorporated from the architecture belt. Okay, so let's find out. What are the system functionality and features? Well, there is a guidelines overview. They call it the guidelines overview. I think that this is the module relevant to the Agile team. So it also has the compliance to the enterprise architecture principles and guidelines are made easy by using different belts. How does it work? So since it has different colors no, in belt, and it represents and indicates overall status of a team in fulfilling guidelines. For example, when you are on the white belt, perhaps you are preparing your the basic guidelines. You are fulfilling the basic guidelines before you do the hard coding, etc. and so on. Then once you fulfill that, then you will be promoted as candidate for yellow belt, meaning to say what are the tasks, what are the guidelines, what are the principles that you need to do when you are now working with the yellow belt. Then go with the dependencies for the green belt until such time that you go to the blue belt. And of course, the black belt represents that you have completed and mastered that specific area of principles and guidelines. And that's actually the beauty of it because if you notice, there's a culture of excellence because there are different teams. Perhaps some of the teams are still on the yellow belt, and some have accomplished already the blue with the blue belt. Then it can be a good practice of reference, and that refers also to the community of practice. Then when you go with the blue belt, then basically, pwede mong hilahin yung other teams eh. And it's a proven situation because it's a case-based situation that it is really effective because you have taken control of the white, yellow, green before you go to the blue, and that makes it also dependencies. And with the photo shown from the illustration, so it consists of different instructions as well on how to fulfill the status. Then another functionality and features is that since it's agile, remember enterprise architecture principles and agile. Since it's agile, adding new guidelines, changing, improving the guidelines for best practices aligned to the community of practice principle, and working on backlogs and communicating to teams and architects are now made possible because there is a certain venue that you can add guideline to the architecture belt. Unlike with the other framework that you need to collaborate first, then wait for the step 2, step 3, step 4, etc. and so on. But this one, teams can perform with individuality. Now again, going back to the agile methods, there's individuality of the teams, but they need to address with the different principles laid down because these principles are approved principles that they need to perform or fulfill. And creating dependencies and prerequisite to the guidelines adds more to the control of compliance and addressing the challenges of tendency to ignore the EA principles and guidelines because you can put should and must. Then if you put must, you cannot go with the yellow belt if you haven't fulfilled the white belt. If you go with the should, it's a recommendation, and you can also perform working the requirements of yellow belt and green belt. But if it's a must, then it's a prerequisite. And that's the beauty of it because it has the dependencies and there will be no more tendency in forgetting the compliance requirement, right? Then another features and functionality is in real life best practices scenario can be documented by linking the guideline to the existing artifacts as a proof of compliance. So let's say you said that, okay, Chris, I have completed the green belt. Then what makes your evidence that you are saying that you have completed the green belt? Then you can tag it actually to the artifact link. There is an artifact link, and you can have the customer journey. You can create a case statement so that considering that we are looking for best practices so that we can practice that in our community of practice, the COP, sorry. Then another functionality and features is that, of course, part of the challenges is the feedback mechanism, right? If you could remember. Then it has a feedback mechanism feature, has been added to notify the architect, the applicability, and if there are new modification, changes, fulfillment from the guideline, or any feedback feature to the document experiences linked to principles and guideline. So you can also rate the guideline. If it's very useful, not relevant, it's just time consuming, or less useful or not useful at all. So the agile teams can rate that, and it automatically provides feedback to the enterprise architect so that they can think of it, they can modify it based on the on the current situation that these agile teams are facing, without further steps that need to follow. It's spontaneous that once they receive this feedback mechanism, they can convene right away. Then another feature or system functionality is that it's a self-thought, because in every I noticed that from architecture belt, I noticed that there is a description in every module, in every sub modules. It's easy to understand, since architecture belt provides title, description, and fulfillment criteria. And these agile teams are guided. They don't really need to think, no? Oh, and to interpret, ano ba tong principle na to? Hindi na ganun. So it's just, okay, let's just follow it. Ito yung description. Applicable ba? Yes or no? So something like that. It's pretty much straightforward, which I really like. And you can have the rationale, no? Rationality, and you can also see if it's really effective, or it is really useful to your agile team if you are the team leader. Then, yeah, just a few more functionality. So you can also create teams for agile, or yeah, you can select if this agile team can work on the software development quality standards, or they are responsible in process design principle, or they can maintain the scalable software for the service applications, the 12-factor principles of service apps, etc. Then it can be customized on the different types and different kinds of team that you have in agile teams. And as mentioned, it can be reflected to the enterprise architecture because of the feedback mechanism. So meaning to say, if I'm the EA, I have the full, perspective. What are the composition of my teams, no? Which is really important, especially if you're the enterprise architect, or the consultant, or the project manager, handling the complexity of this kind of project. Then I think two more or three more. Another functionality is, of course, as mentioned, there are KPIs. KPIs can be set, the key performance indicators can be set, so that you can put standards in everything. Minsan kasi ibang programmer, di ba, mabilis sila sa ganito, mabagal sila sa ganito. So you can put KPIs so that you can have that control over the time element, the delivery, service delivery commitments. Then, yeah, and this is really one of my favorite, because there is a team dashboard. Diba? So in Agile, yeah, dashboard is really important, right? And displaying the current situation, activity feed, and progress. So if we are on the team, for example, we are on the team 12 factor. All right, we have completed the white belt. So what's next? So the next, Chris, is we need to go with the green belt. So naka-ready na. So by Friday, yun yung target. It says that November 2018, November 30, 2018. Then what's the progress for our current situation? We have 50% progress. So it's automated. It's really automated. Then another one is actually the last feature that I would like to share with you is that from the authors and from the article, of course, is that the project full cycle overview, which is part also of the agile methods, as mentioned, the SDM. Then this dashboard, you can see the status of fulfillment, no, of different teams. Like for example, you have the 12-factor teams, which is the newbies, 12-factor, which is the ninjas, which it contains the blue belt, then partly 12-factor, there are white belts, or you can add more teams. Then what does it mean? No, it says that these teams can monitor their achievements, fulfillments of the guidelines and principles set, the best practices, success stories, and other results that are necessity that supports the enterprise architecture principles and guidelines in a large-scale agile development. So if you notice, there are also guidelines here. The guidelines for white belt is to work on the dependency code base, and now if you're done with that, you can now be promoted as yellow belt. Then you can do now the build, release, run guidelines and dev prod parity, and of course the configuration up to the creation of logs, disposability, and concurrency, which is under the black belt. So those are the things, and the good thing about this one is, it's color says it all. So if you notice that you are on the white, diba? So tapos lahat nasa green. So there's a culture na team collaboration. Okay, you can ask, paano kayo nakapunta diyan? Yeah. And it can be practiced because there are success stories linked with artifacts, no, with the different situations of different teams. And now, enterprise architect and project managers can now handle the teams based on their capabilities, no? Sino na ba yung nakatapos sa ganito? And that's really make, looks cool, and also um, save a lot of time and of course cost. Then yeah, to discuss also, I got two more slides left on my presentation. I would just like to highlight these design principles mentioned from the article, which is I've learned also from our subject, the advanced systems design. And it says that the first principle that they use is that people are more likely to comply with a request when they see that other people have also complied, right? It's a fact. Then another design principle of architecture belt is that combining contribution with social contact with other contributors causes members to contribute more, right? So yung culture na bibuild. Then another design principle that they use is that performance feedback, especially positive feedback, can enhance motivation to perform tasks, di ba? Because there are feedbacks rewards program from the architecture belt, and you can incorporate. For example, if you go with this black belt the soonest time, yung savings ko, di ba? Yung kalahati nun, bigay ko na lang, di ba? Something like that. So if you're an enterprise architect. Then another design principle is that providing members with specific and highly challenging goals, whether self-set or system-suggested, increases contribution, right? Then another principle is goals have greater effects when people receive frequent feedback about their performance with respect to the goals. And with this kind of principle, you know for yourself that you are perfectly aligned with the goals, and wala kang po problemahin masyado. Baka dumami backlog ko, baka maling ginagawa ko. You are really guided with architecture belt. Then another design principle of architecture belt is that comparative performance feedback can enhance motivation, as long as high performance is viewed as desirable and potentially obtainable, or the culture of excellence. Then rewards, whether in the form of status, privileges, or material benefits, motivate contributions can be handled. Then, if you notice, everything is actually perfectly aligned to what we have tackled from our course, or this course, the Advanced Systems Design. Well, there are initiation that happens, such as feasibility study, targeting the improvements of information workflows, right? We have studied that. It also covers the analysis and the system design, which is really evident by defining the design principles and make it as the boundary of the advanced system design for a complex situation. Alam ko may subject tayong ganyan dyan eh, di ba? Then another one is that, what else? Yeah, the process of system build kicked in, no? Also for the actual building of architecture build, as we notice, based on the strategy. There is a strategy, there is a design principle, and of course aligned to the business requirements and functional requirements, targeting the defined objectives of the business organization. Then, of course, information security is not forgotten too. If you could remember from the previous slide or from the previous topic that I've shared, is that on how the system was architected, the system architecture. It's really, they handle the information security well, and creating of teams for specific functions so that collaboration is there, but walang breaches, no, with the functionality, and also the dependency flow dependency, and etc. No, there are a lot of things that tackled with that article, based on our lectures, past discussion with Sir GP. Then for the conclusion, limitations and future work for architecture build. Well, this is my last slide. Yeah, I would like to tackle three things. First, the benefits of architecture build defines in threefold, as mentioned by the authors. The first one is to motivate agile teams in the formulation and usage of architecture principles and guidelines, because it is, we really need to comply, because hindi naman yan parang ano lang eh, what do you call this, palamuti. So we really need to comply if we are part of the agile team, because there is a certain business objectives associated with that. Then another one is provide a central place for managing and documenting principles and guidelines, as well as related information, since we are practicing agile. Then better compliance with principles and guidelines, of course. Then the second one that I would like to tackle is the limitations. Of course, not all systems are perfect. Of course, perfect for the time being, yes, or for the functionality, yes. But it goes beyond. When we say limitations, since we are dealing also digital transformation, no, it doesn't stops. No, right now architecture build as described by the authors is not cannot integrate yet to the GitHub or other repositories. So that's the challenging one. If you are using already the other repositories, you cannot integrate that, or perhaps you can create APIs. Then number two limitation is that not yet fully tested, no, or made the stress test to fully operational in a large scale enterprise, because it just uses to one case, no, to one case, to a specific case. Then, well, I just noticed that there is also other applicability, not just for software development or ERP systems or complex systems like ERP. You can also use this prototype or idea of the architecture build. I think it can work well to other domains like data security, data protection, or process design principles, or service design principles. Like in data security, like if you are working with vulnerability assessment and penetration testing, there are a lot of steps, right? And you can use different belts so that you can, every information security officer or engineers can, can promote best practices that can be applied to different units of the organization. Well, that's it. So yeah, thank you, and I would like to give credits, of course, to Google as always for the photos, and of course for the authors, Uludağ, Sasha Nägele, Matthes, Hauder, and Florian Matthes for us for my other information references, which is the architecting the digital transformation. Yeah, thank you so much for listening.